before he closed his eyes for the final time. Before the bells of St. Peter's tolled and the world fell into a hush of mourning, Pope Francis whispered something few were prepared to hear. It was not political, not poetic, not even entirely his own. It was a truth passed down through the silence of generations, hidden behind Vatican walls, locked in drawers. No hand dared open fully, until now. "Do not let this be forgotten," he said to those closest to him. "Tell them what I saw. Tell them what is already here." This was no ordinary message. It was the kind of secret that makes the soul tremble, not from fear, but from recognition. A secret that had been sealed, debated, delayed. And in his final days, he knew he could not carry it to the grave. You may have heard whispers of it, the third secret of Fatima. You may have thought it was already revealed, already discussed, already dismissed. But what if that was only part of the truth? What if there was something deeper, darker, yet unbearably full of grace? What Pope Francis revealed before his death has the power to shake your spirit, to pierce your apathy, to open your eyes to the battle you were born into but never trained to fight. And if you think this is just another story, just another prophecy, just another echo of a time long gone, then you've already fallen asleep. And this message is your final alarm. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will touch your soul in ways you didn't expect. This is not a conspiracy. It's not a thriller. It's a call to awaken, a call to remember, a call to prepare. Before his death, Pope Francis revealed a terrifying secret. And now, it's your turn to hear it. The terrifying secret Pope Francis could no longer keep. The secret Pope Francis carried was not written in headlines. It would never be shouted from pulpits. It was quieter than that, more sacred. And perhaps that's why it was more terrifying, because it required no enemy, no explosion, no fire from the sky. Only silence, only blindness, only hearts that no longer burned for the truth. It had to do with Fatima, but not the part the world already knows, not the vision of hell or the call to consecrate Russia. No, this was the part left sealed, the part whispered in corridors, hinted at by mystics, feared by cardinals, and dismissed by those too proud to believe that heaven still speaks to earth. For years, the Vatican had treated the third secret as something to be managed, interpreted, softened. When it was finally released in 2000, the official version told of a white-robed bishop walking through a ruined city, falling under gunfire, a vision many linked to the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. But even then, even in the moment of its release, something felt missing. The imagery was vague. The explanation was careful, too careful, as if something had been withheld, as if the Church, in her maternal caution, had chosen to reveal only what would not shake the faithful too deeply. Pope Benedict XVI once hinted at it. He said that the vision was not merely about a moment in history, but about the ongoing spiritual trial of the Church, a crisis from within, a mystery not yet fulfilled. And Pope Francis knew it was time to speak plainly. In his final private addresses, behind closed doors with a few trusted clergy, he began to speak of the true meaning hidden beneath the symbols. Not a prophecy of external war, but of internal decay. Not the fall of buildings, but the collapse of conviction. Not the persecution of the body, but the seduction of the soul. The terrifying secret was this: the greatest danger to the Church was not outside her walls, it was within them. a slow apostasy, a bleeding out of faith disguised as progress, a generation losing its reverence. The Virgin Mary had warned of this. She said that if the world did not repent, not only would nations fall, but faith itself would be eclipsed. And now, Francis saw it happening. He had tried to warn gently, to lead through mercy, to point toward the poor and the wounded, to call for hearts to awaken. But as he neared death, he knew mercy also required truth, and the truth could no longer wait. He gathered his strength in those last days, not to preserve his image, but to preserve a flame flickering in the wind of an age too enamored with its own noise to hear heaven's weeping. He reminded those around him. The message of Fatima was not about fear, but fidelity. Not about punishment, but preparation. Not about dread, but decision. He did not name names. He did not condemn. But his voice grew solemn when he spoke of the third secret's fullness. He confirmed what many had feared, that the vision of the white-robed bishop walking through ruins was not a warning of the past, but a mirror of the present. And in that mirror, he saw himself. He saw the church exhausted by division. He saw truth dressed up as dialogue, but emptied of courage. He saw faithful Catholics mocked, tradition abandoned, and prayer replaced with performance. And he knew that if he remained silent, he would fail in the one mission Mary had entrusted to her children, to bear witness, even when it hurts. That is why, in his final breath, he did not cling to secrecy. He opened his soul. He made it known that the true threat we face is not collapse from without, but corrosion from within. A church that forgets how to weep. A people who no longer believe they need saving. Before his death, Pope Francis did not reveal a prophecy of doom. He revealed a plea from heaven itself. And now that he is gone, the question echoes across time. Will we listen? Or will we wait until the silence becomes irreversible? Fatima Revisited. A century-old message ignored. What began in 1917 in a small village in Portugal may now be fully unfolding. The apparitions of the Virgin Mary at Fatima were not just for the past. They are a prophecy for now. What was hidden for over a century is finally being understood. The hills of Fatima were quiet when heaven came. It was a time of war, of unrest, of confusion. The world, bruised by the violence of World War I, was already forgetting how to pray. And into this forgetful world, heaven sent a message, not to kings, not to theologians, not even to the clergy, but to 3 small children, barefoot and wide-eyed, whose hearts were unclouded by pride: Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta. Just shepherd children. Simple, untouched by ambition. Chosen not for their wisdom, but for their innocence. For it is always the childlike who receive the deepest truths. The lady appeared to them clothed in light, brighter than the sun, her eyes filled with a sorrow that pierced more than words. And what she said to them was not simply a sweet vision to be remembered. It was a warning to be heeded, a call that would ring through time, waiting for the world to wake up. She came with 3 secrets. The first, a vision of hell, not metaphor, not symbolism, but a piercing glimpse of eternal separation from God. The children saw it, felt it, heard the screams, and for the rest of their lives, they carried that memory like a scar on the soul. Not because Mary wished to frighten them, but because the world had forgotten what was at stake. The second secret was a prophecy, that if the world did not turn back to God, a second war would come, worse than the first. She named the signs. She spoke of Russia. She warned of communism, a force that would rise like a shadow across the earth, choking faith, persecuting the righteous, silencing the gospel. And just as she said, it came. The Second War erupted. Russia spread its errors. Millions perished. And still, the world did not turn back. But it was the third secret that would remain veiled for decades, hidden, sheltered, held close by the church with trembling hands. Pope Francis, in his final reflections, began to speak of Fatima not as a relic of Catholic history, but as a living cry from heaven. He had studied the texts. He had read the accounts. But more than that, he had walked through the signs. He had seen the fading of belief, not in statistics, but in faces, in the lukewarm gaze of congregations, in the silence of confessions that no longer filled the booth, in the way the sacred had become routine and then irrelevant. He knew what many refused to admit, that we are living in the shadow of Fatima's third prophecy, that what Mary foretold is not something to come, but something already here. The white-robed bishop walking through the ruins was not just an image of papal martyrdom. It was a mirror, a church under siege, not by enemies from without, but by forgetfulness from within. Faith without fire, rites without reverence. A people so eager to modernize that they forgot what makes them eternal. Francis spoke gently, but his words carried weight. He often said that Fatima is not about fear, it is about fidelity. That Mary did not come to paralyze the church with dread, but to awaken her with mercy. To remind her that the true crisis is not politics, not power, not even persecution, but forgetfulness. The soul's slow drift into numbness. A church that forgets how to kneel. He returned to this again and again, in his homilies, in his travels, in his prayers before statues of Our Lady. He called the faithful to revisit Fatima, not with nostalgia, but with urgency, because the message was never about a past moment. It was a map, a divine warning, a mother's voice crying out before the house collapses. Fatima was never just for Portugal. It was never just for 1917. It was for now, for this generation, for this hour when light and darkness are clashing louder than ever. And Pope Francis knew that if we do not return to that hill, if we do not return to her Immaculate Heart, we may not find our way back at all. Because Fatima was not a moment. It was a prophecy, and the time for ignoring it is over. The third secret: why the Church was afraid to tell the world. Why did the Vatican delay the release of the third secret until the year 2000? And even then, why did so many scholars believe only part of it was revealed? Pope Francis wrestled with this very question, and what he discovered shattered him. The third secret of Fatima was supposed to be revealed in 1960. Sister Lucia herself had written it down under obedience, sealed it in an envelope, and handed it over to church authorities with the understanding that it would be disclosed no later than that year. By 1960, she once said, it will be clearer. But when 1960 arrived, the envelope was not opened to the world. Instead, it was locked away, whispered about, guarded. The official explanation was careful, diplomatic. The world wasn't ready. The timing wasn't right. The implications were too great. But outside Vatican walls, the silence spoke louder than words. People asked why. They asked what could be so devastating, so disorienting, that the Church itself would choose silence over disclosure. And the longer the secret was withheld, the more the questions multiplied. For 40 years, speculation grew like a storm gathering above a sleeping village. Some believed it contained a prophecy of global destruction. Others whispered of an assassination, a papal betrayal, or even a schism at the highest levels of the Church. And then, in the year 2000, the Vatican finally published what it claimed was the complete text of the Third Secret, a vision of a white-robed bishop ascending a hill of destruction, passing through a city of ruins, and falling beneath a hail of bullets and arrows. But even as the words were read aloud, something didn't sit right. The imagery was vivid, yes, but vague. There were no names, no specific warnings, no urgent commands. The gravity of Fatima's first two secrets, the vision of hell, the prophecy of world war, was missing. This final vision, we were told, had already been fulfilled in the 1981 assassination attempt on John Paul II. The explanation was presented. The file was closed. But many could not believe it. Cardinals like Chiappi and Audi hinted that what was released was only a portion. Archbishop Vigano, in his later years, would call it a partial disclosure dressed in symbolic interpretation. Even Pope Benedict XVI, who had overseen the publication of the secret as then Cardinal Ratzinger, later suggested that the most dangerous part of the prophecy may not have been in the vision at all, but in the words that followed it. Pope Francis knew this debate well. He had read the texts, not just the published vision, but what lay deeper, what lay behind locked doors, the private documents, the notes, the suppressed warnings. And what he found was not a thriller. It was a mirror held up to the soul of the Church. And what it reflected brought him to his knees. He saw in the hidden lines of that prophecy a deep and sorrowful truth, that the greatest chastisement would not be physical, but spiritual. A loss not of life, but of faith. The words of the Blessed Mother had been clear. If her warnings were not heeded, if Russia was not consecrated, if prayer and penance were not embraced, the Church would suffer a trial like none before. Not from outside forces, but from within. The true terror of the Third Secret was not war. It was apostasy, a church in disarray, divided, bleeding from within, shepherds no longer guarding the flock, truth diluted, holiness ridiculed, and at the center of it all, a growing coldness toward the gospel itself, a faith transformed into formality, tradition emptied of its fire. The vision of the bishop falling in the ruins was not only a vision of martyrdom, it was a symbol of the Church's own woundedness. If revealed in 1960, it would have been a wound. But in 2000, it became a scar. And now, in the era of Francis, it had become a mirror held to the conscience of the entire Catholic world. He knew that to speak plainly about it would invite outrage, denial, dismissal. But he also knew that to stay silent would be to betray not just a message, but a mother who had wept over the future of her church and had begged her children to return to God while there was still time. And so, Pope Francis, frail, aging, accused, misunderstood, chose to let it be known, quietly, not in a broadcast, not in a document, but in his words, in his warnings, in his weariness. He let the world know that the Third Secret was never just about a vision. It was about a choice. And the time to make that choice is now. The vision of a dying church. Martyrdom without blood. In a chilling prophecy, the Virgin showed a vision of a church in ruins, a white-robed bishop walking through a city reduced to rubble. Was this a metaphor for persecution, or for something more dangerous? Spiritual collapse from within? The image is haunting, a city broken, the sacred toppled. the silence of abandonment thick in the air. A bishop, clothed in white, walking with quiet resolve through the ashes of what once stood tall. His path is lined with corpses, priests, religious, lay faithful, all fallen. There is no crowd, no choir, no triumph. Only the slow march toward a hill where he too will fall, pierced by unseen arrows, swallowed by the same silence that claimed the rest. When the third secret was finally revealed, this vision was its centerpiece. Many rushed to link it to the assassination attempt on John Paul II. They said the bullets were literal. The bishop in white was the Pope. The vision was fulfilled. And yet, even John Paul II, the man who survived those bullets, felt otherwise. What Francis saw in that vision was not merely a physical martyrdom, but something quieter, something deeper, a martyrdom without blood, a slow death, not from violence, but from within. This was the part no one wanted to name, that the ruins in the vision may not be the aftermath of bombs or war, but the remnants of a church that had forgotten who she was. A church disfigured not by enemies, but by indifference. A city reduced not by fire, but by forgetfulness. And the white-robed bishop? Not a solitary man caught in a moment of history, but every shepherd who bears the weight of a church that no longer knows how to kneel. Francis would often pause when speaking of this, not because he doubted, but because he mourned. It wasn't about persecution, not in the way the early martyrs faced lions and prisons. It was about a spiritual famine, a church where sacraments became rituals, and rituals became optional, where holiness was traded for relevance, where reverence was shelved for performance, where the truth, once thundered, was now whispered, if spoken at all. The bishop in white walks alone, because those around him have already fallen. That is what the vision shows us. Not just a pope at risk, but a priesthood in crisis, a laity scattered, a world that no longer recognizes the sacred. The death is slow, but it is real. And yet Francis did not see this vision as a reason to despair. He saw it as a call, a final warning. Francis knew this. He had said it in so many ways, that comfort was killing us, that ease was numbing us, that the church, if she wished to rise again, must pass through this valley, must lose her pride, must shed her attachments, must become poor in spirit once more. He spoke of the ruins not as the end, but as the beginning. Because what Mary showed the children of Fatima was not a prediction, it was a pattern, the pattern of Christ, death, burial, resurrection. The vision of the dying church was not the death of faith. It was the stripping away of what is false, a purification, a martyrdom of the spirit. He called it the martyrdom without blood, and it was already here. That is the moment we are living in now. The vision is no longer a future possibility. It is a present reality. The rubble surrounds us. The silence thickens. The world turns its back on the sacred. And yet, the church walks on. The question is not whether the vision will come true. It already has. The question is, who will walk with the bishop now? Who will carry the cross beside him? Who will remain faithful in a city of ruins? Because martyrdom has come, not with fire, but with silence, not with swords, but with forgetfulness. And it is in this hour that the true witness is needed more than ever. Apostasy from within, the silent erosion of truth. Pope Francis warned not of an external enemy, but of an internal one. A slow, almost invisible betrayal. Bishops against bishops. Cardinals against cardinals. The church itself trembling under the weight of compromise and confusion. This was the part of the prophecy that most refused to face. Not because it was too mysterious, but because it was too familiar. The wounds Mary spoke of were not inflicted by tyrants or soldiers. They were self-inflicted. And that is what made them unbearable. In his final years, Pope Francis began to speak with increasing clarity about the crisis. He did not shout. He did not condemn. But he carried a grief in his voice that seemed to weigh heavier with each passing month. He saw what many chose not to see, that the greatest threat to the body of Christ was not persecution from governments, but pollution from within. He called it a silent apostasy, not a revolt in the streets, but a whisper in the sanctuary. It did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like a draft beneath a closed door. The signs were everywhere. Homilies emptied of truth, reshaped to fit popular sentiment. Seminaries where orthodoxy was mocked and compromise was rewarded. Bishops hesitant to speak on sin, lest they offend. Liturgies stripped of reverence, sacraments treated as ceremony. And the faithful, so many of them, left without a compass, wandering why the light felt dimmer than before. Francis had seen it up close. He saw the division growing, not just in doctrine, but in spirit. The church that once spoke with one voice now murmured in discord. Unity had become a slogan, not a strength. And the very guardians of the gospel had begun to disagree on what the gospel even meant. He spoke often of the great distortion, that creeping idea that the faith could be customized to fit the age, that morality was flexible, that truth was negotiable, that love meant silence. And in the name of mercy, truth was being buried alive. He knew mercy was real, but mercy without truth was just appeasement. Francis did not believe the church was dying, but he knew she was being sifted, and he wept for her. Not as a ruler weeps for his kingdom, but as a father weeps for his children. He saw the loss not in numbers, but in hearts. Young people leaving, vocations fading, devotion thinning, a spiritual anemia that no program, no counsel, no clever document could cure. He called the church to return, not to the past, but to the cross, to that narrow way, that costly obedience, that fire of holiness that once set saints ablaze. There were those who accused him, who said he had allowed too much, who said he was too lenient. Others claimed he was too rigid, too nostalgic. And maybe that was the mark of his suffering, that he stood in the center of a church at war with itself. Not with fists, but with ideology. Not with fire, but with fog. A war where clarity was controversial, and silence was safer than conviction. He began to speak more plainly, not to condemn, but to call, to remind, to warn. He did not want to be remembered as a pope who kept peace through avoidance. He wanted to be remembered as a shepherd who stayed awake while the wolves approached, who kept his lamp lit even when the oil was low, who whispered truth in the dark, hoping it would light a fire in just one more soul. And as the church trembled under the weight of its own confusion, he turned again to Mary. He knelt before her, as he had done countless times before, not to ask for rescue, but for strength, for wisdom, for courage to endure the martyrdom of fidelity in a world that no longer wanted to hear it. This is the apostasy the Virgin warned of, not dramatic, not televised, but quiet, steady, almost invisible, until the altar is empty, The heart is dry, and no one can remember what once made us fall to our knees. Pope Francis saw it. He named it. And in his own broken way, he resisted it. Not with thunder, but with tears. Not with triumph, but with truth. And now that he is gone, the question remains. Will we? Mary's plea, prayer, penance, and the forgotten weapon. In nearly every Marian apparition, she repeats the same command. Pray the rosary. This is not superstition. It is the chain that holds back darkness. Why then have so many discarded it? Why did Francis call it the Church's last defense? From Lourdes to Akita, from Guadalupe to Fatima, her voice has never wavered. Her words have shifted with culture, with language, with time. But the message is always the same. Return to prayer. Return to penance. Return to the rosary. And yet, in a world saturated with technology and noise, it became an echo, easily ignored. But Pope Francis never ignored it. He spoke of the rosary not as a relic of an old church, but as a weapon forged by heaven. He called it the breath of the humble, the rhythm of the faithful, the lullaby that calms the storm. To him, it was not optional. It was essential. He once said the rosary was a chain that binds the devil and looses grace. A line that many thought poetic until they looked closer, until they realized that for Francis, this was not metaphor. It was literal. He had seen what happens when prayer disappears. She said that without prayer, the soul grows numb, that without penance, sin becomes normal, that without the rosary, the church will lose her fire. She didn't say this to burden us. She said it to save us. And Francis knew we were running out of time. He spoke often of a church distracted, busy with plans, with meetings, with noise, yet spiritually dry. He said we had become efficient, but not intimate, professional, but not prayerful. And in that dryness, the enemy had found his foothold. So he returned again and again to the rosary, to those beads worn smooth by generations of fingers, passed from grandmother to child, from priest to penitent. He held his own tightly, often quietly, often alone. When asked why he prayed it so much, he said, "Because I forget, because I wander, because I am weak. And this is how I come home." It was not ritual for him. It was rescue. He knew that each Hail Mary was not repetition, but intercession. He recalled how saints had used it to drive out demons, how whole armies had been turned away not by swords, but by prayer, how Our Lady of Lepanto won a battle with 1,000,000 whispered prayers. And he asked, "Have we forgotten?" Yes, we have. We have forgotten that prayer isn't weakness, it's warfare. We have forgotten that penance isn't punishment, it's healing. We have forgotten that the rosary isn't just beads. It's a mirror, showing us Christ, mystery by mystery, wound by wound, glory by glory. Francis did not call for politics. He called for penance. He did not launch campaigns. He called for confession. He did not ask us to reinvent the church. He asked us to remember her. And as the world trembled, as confusion deepened, as faith flickered, he held up the rosary like a torch in the night. "This," he said, "is how we fight. Not with fists, not with anger, but with faith, with prayer, with penance, with the forgotten weapon heaven placed in our hands long ago. He is gone now, but the weapon remains. The chain of light, the call to return. Will we pick it up? Or will we wait until the darkness surrounds us completely? Mary is still waiting, still pleading. The rosary is not superstition. It is survival. The consecration of Russia, a prophecy delayed. She asked for Russia to be consecrated to her Immaculate Heart and warned what would happen if the world delayed. We delayed. The results? War, persecution, and moral collapse. And yet, Francis still believed it was not too late. The request was simple: a mother's voice, sorrowful yet firm. In 1917, standing beneath the aching skies of Fatima, the Virgin Mary made her plea that Russia be consecrated to her Immaculate Heart, that a solemn act of entrustment be made, not as a political gesture, but as a spiritual shield. She warned that if her request was not fulfilled, Russia would spread its errors throughout the world, causing wars, suffering, and the persecution of the faithful. The Church listened and waited. Decades passed. The request echoed, but the response hesitated. Not in one sudden blow, but in waves. The rise of militant atheism, the silencing of faith, the systematic tearing down of churches, the gulags, the martyrs buried in the snow, millions dead, millions more spiritually disoriented. And as Russia's errors spread, so did the infection. Ideologies rooted in materialism, in relativism, in the denial of God. It was not only Eastern Europe that trembled. It was the soul of the West that began to fracture. And yet, even then, we debated. Even then, we hesitated. In 1984, Pope John Paul II, a man forged by the fires of communism, stood before the world and made the consecration, entrusting the entire human family, including Russia, to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. It was a powerful moment, a prayer wrapped in courage and clarity. And in the years that followed, the world watched in awe as the Iron Curtain began to tear. The Berlin Wall crumbled. The Soviet machine faltered. It was not coincidence. It was consecration in motion. But even then, the question lingered. Was it done as she had asked? Sister Lucia, the surviving visionary of Fatima, later confirmed her peace with the consecration. Others remained unsure. Some pointed to missing details. Others clung to the belief that something was still unfinished. Pope Francis came into this conversation late, but not too late. He had read the history. He had studied the messages. He knew the weight of the Virgin's words. And in 2022, in the shadow of new wars, new tensions, and new persecutions, he did what few expected. He consecrated Russia and Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in a global act of unity. A moment that drew the attention of the world, not for its pageantry, but for its timing, for its trembling relevance, for the sense that heaven was still watching. Some questioned it, others dismissed it. But for Francis, it was not a performance. It was a cry of repentance, a final offering. He believed the hour was late, but not lost. Knees bending, prayers rising like incense toward the one who had warned us from the beginning, not to control us, but to save us. Francis knew this wasn't just about Russia. It was about the Church, about the world, about every soul entangled in the errors that had spread. And though the headlines moved on, though the cameras turned elsewhere, he kept returning to Mary's plea. He said once, "To consecrate is to return. Return to humility. Return to reverence. Return to the safety of a heart that has no stain, no pride, no rebellion." Mary's heart is not a symbol. It is a refuge. and we have delayed long enough. The world burns, the church bleeds, and the battle grows colder, not louder. But in that silence, a mother still waits. And Pope Francis, before his death, reminded us that the invitation still stands, that it has not expired, that her heart is still open, still ready to shelter us, if only we will walk through the door. He believed it was not too late, but he also believed the window was narrowing, that mercy, though abundant, must be accepted before it is withdrawn. That consecration is not a once-and-done ritual, but a posture of the soul, a daily surrender, a daily yes. And now the yes must be ours, not in theory, but in prayer, in penance, in a return. We delayed, but we can still return. The hour is later than we think, but her heart is still waiting. The signs of the times, wars, plagues, and a groaning earth. From pandemics to wildfires, from war in the east to unrest in the west. Are these mere events or echoes of the chastisement Mary foretold? Pope Francis began to see a pattern, and in private he wept over it. He was not the kind of man to indulge in hysteria. He did not speak in apocalyptic tones, nor did he chase signs and wonders. But he was a man of deep silence, a man who listened, not only to people, but to heaven. And in the quiet, he began to see something he could not ignore. It came not as thunder, but as rhythm, a pattern of suffering that echoed louder with each passing year. The world was groaning. It groaned through the cries of children buried beneath the rubble of forgotten wars. Francis saw it all, not through the lens of headlines, but through the eyes of a shepherd watching his flock scatter. The pandemic was a mirror. It showed us not only the fragility of our bodies, but the sickness of our souls. The isolation revealed more than physical distance. It revealed spiritual disconnection. Churches closed, sacraments suspended, and many never returned. Not because of fear, but because they had already forgotten what it meant to kneel. He wept, not because the virus spread, but because hearts had already grown cold. And then came the wars. The Virgin did not speak in metaphors. She named the cost of our pride. She named the toll of our rebellion. She warned that without prayer, without penance, without consecration, suffering would come, not as vengeance, but as consequence. And now, as cities burned and borders crumbled, Francis began to see that the warning had not been heard. Not truly. He spoke more softly in those days, more slowly. He no longer offered predictions. He offered invitations to pray, to return, to wake. Because the signs were no longer hidden in the clouds. They were written on the earth itself. Even nature had begun to cry out. Wildfires consumed entire regions in hours. Floods tore through cities without warning. Earthquakes broke open land that had stood firm for generations. Species vanished. Resources dried. And the people, still, did not listen. They debated. They blamed. They politicized. But the earth kept groaning. Romans 8 had once spoken of creation longing for redemption, waiting with eager expectation for the revealing of the children of God. But now it felt more like lament, like creation itself was weary of waiting. And still, the church argued, doctrines diluted, confusion permitted, truth bartered for acceptance. And all the while, Mary's voice still echoed, pray, repent, return. Not because God desires fear, but because he desires souls. Because mercy precedes judgment, but not forever. Francis wept for this, not in grand gestures, but in moments unseen, in the chapel before dawn, in the whisper of a rosary late at night, in the tremble of his hands as he laid them over the sick, knowing that healing was deeper than medicine. He wept for a world too proud to bow, for a church too busy to listen, for a people distracted by noise, unable to hear the rumbling of heaven beneath their feet. He said once, "We are not being punished, we are being awakened." But awakening requires pain, and many would rather sleep through the storm than walk through the fire toward the light. The signs are here. They surround us. They speak in weather, in war, in the quiet ache of a soul that knows something is wrong but cannot name it. These are not random tragedies. They are calls, bells in the night. Mary rang them over a century ago, and Pope Francis, before his death, rang them again, not with alarms, but with love. Because the groaning of the world is not a song of despair. It is a cry for redemption, and the time to respond is now. Silence in the Vatican. What is still being hidden? Even after the official release in 2000, whispers of another document, a missing page, a warning too grave to print, have persisted. Did Pope Francis see it? And was that the reason for his final, trembling revelation? The Vatican is no stranger to mystery. Its walls have held secrets for centuries, secrets of saints and sinners, of councils and crusades, of light and shadow. But none has stirred more speculation, more unease, than the question that continues to echo through marble corridors and prayerful whispers. Was the third secret of Fatima fully revealed? When the Holy See finally released the vision in June of 2000, it was met not with closure, but with questions. What was shown to the world was solemn, yes, apocalyptic in imagery, and filled with symbolic weight. A white-robed bishop, walking through a city of ruins, ascending a hill littered with bodies, only to be struck down. The church in mourning, the world in silence, the suffering of the righteous. It was powerful, but it was incomplete. There were no words from Mary herself in the released text, no explicit commentary, no direct message. And yet, history had told us there were more than just images. Sister Lucia had spoken of being entrusted with a message, one that explained the vision. A message she wrote down by hand. A message meant to be revealed no later than 1960. A message she said would make more sense then. But when the year came, the Vatican chose to wait. And when they finally spoke, they offered a vision without the message. It was as if a door had been opened, but only halfway. Enough to glimpse a shape in the dark, not enough to know what it meant. Many believed there was another document, a companion to the vision. Words from the Virgin herself, detailing the meaning of the destruction, the cause of the chastisement, the condition of the church. Some claimed it was too alarming to release, too direct, too implicating, not of world war or natural disaster, but of apostasy, a spiritual collapse, a defection from within the hierarchy itself. Cardinals whispered about it. Scholars wrote cautiously around it. Malachi Martin, a Jesuit priest and former Vatican insider, hinted that the real secret spoke of a pope under control, of a dark spiritual deception at the heart of the church's leadership. Others dismissed him. And then came Francis. He was not a man drawn to controversy. He preferred simplicity, humility, but he was not naive. He had seen the division growing long before he wore the white cassock. He had felt the tremors in the foundation, the shifting moral language, the hollowing of reverence. the political games played beneath the dome of St. Peter's. And as he aged, those tremors turned to cracks. And still, the Vatican kept its silence. But Francis couldn't. Not entirely. Those close to him in his final days described a change. Not in his theology, but in his urgency. He spoke more often of deception, of vigilance, of the need to stay awake. He quoted Fatima more. He returned, again and again, to Mary's voice. He hinted at things he had read, documents he had seen, lines that haunted him. He never confirmed the existence of a hidden text, but his words suggested a knowledge he could not fully share. In one of his last private homilies, not televised, not published, just spoken before a small group of clergy, he said this: "The greatest wound to the Church is not caused by those who attack her from outside. It is caused when those entrusted with her light no longer believe it burns." Those who heard him said there were tears in his eyes, not of anger, but of grief. A grief born from knowing that something had been hidden for too long, that in withholding the fullness of the truth, a window of grace had been left partially closed, and time was running out. Did he see the missing page? Did he read the warning the world was not given? Only heaven knows. But what we do know is this: he lived and died with the urgency of a man who had glimpsed something terrifying. And what remains hidden may not be a paper in a vault, but a truth buried in our own unwillingness to repent. The silence of the Vatican may be strategic, or fearful, or reverent, but the silence of the soul, that is what Mary came to shatter. And Pope Francis, in his final days, tried to do the same, not with force, not with fame, but with a whisper. And now that whisper is ours to hear, or to ignore. The spiritual war, relativism, secularism, and the death of truth. The terrifying secret is not about fire from the sky. It is about a fire that no longer burns in hearts. A church without conviction. A faith without transformation. Francis warned that spiritual apathy is the devil's quietest victory. He had seen it grow, year by year, like a slow frost creeping across the soul of the church. Not loud, not sudden, but gradual. Deadly. A spiritual chill that silenced voices, dimmed altars, and made once burning hearts flicker like dying candles. It was not persecution that concerned Pope Francis most. It was indifference, a loss of zeal, a comfort with compromise so subtle that most did not even realize it was happening. He called it a war, but not with bombs or borders. A war not fought on battlefields, but in classrooms, in living rooms, in parishes, and in hearts. It was the battle for truth, and in many places, truth was losing. Relativism had become a kind of religion, one that demanded no obedience, no sacrifice, no cross. And the fire, once so fierce in the hearts of saints, grew cold. He did not speak of this with anger. He spoke of it with sorrow, because he understood the seduction of it, the temptation to smooth the edges of the gospel, to make Jesus more palatable, to make the church more appealing. But he knew what Mary had warned, that the greatest danger would not be open rebellion, but subtle decay. Secularism became the air we breathed, and in many places, faith became a private comfort rather than a public conviction. Churches stayed open, but their pews emptied. Crosses hung on walls, but no longer on hearts. Sacraments were celebrated, but often without awe. Prayer became performance, and truth, absolute, eternal, sacred truth, was no longer welcomed. It was tolerated at best, mocked at worst. Francis saw that this was not simply a change in culture. It was an assault on the soul. Because once truth dies, everything else follows. When sin becomes a suggestion, when holiness becomes outdated, when God becomes optional, then the church becomes a museum, not a mission. He warned that the devil no longer needed to roar. He only needed to lull. And in the lullaby of relativism, many had fallen asleep. He said once, "The greatest victory of the enemy is not when we are afraid, but when we no longer care." This spiritual war was not just theological. It was personal. It showed up in marriages falling apart because commitment was replaced with convenience. In children who grew up in churches but walked away because they never encountered power, only programs. In leaders who once burned for Christ but now negotiated his words to stay in favor with the world. It was in these hidden wounds that Francis saw the fulfillment of the prophecy. Not fire from heaven, but fire extinguished from within. The secret of Fatima, he believed, was not meant to terrify. It was meant to clarify. It was not about doom, but about the real battle for the heart of the church. And that battle was here. He never blamed the world for being the world. He grieved when the church stopped being the church, when salt lost its taste, when light was hidden, when shepherds forgot how to lead, and the sheep, longing for truth, found only echoes. He urged the faithful not to be swept away by the tides of opinion, not to trade eternity for acceptance, not to reshape the gospel into a mirror. The truth, he said, does not evolve. It reveals. And though it may wound, it heals. Though it may divide, it also delivers. This was the war he fought, not with weapons, but with tears, not in headlines, but in homilies. He knew he was not the last word, but he hoped he could be a voice, a reminder, a warning, that the fire which once set saints ablaze still waits to be rekindled, because the devil's victory is not found in violence. It is found in lukewarm hearts, in the death of truth, in a church that forgets its mission and remembers only how to survive. Francis did not want a church that survives. He wanted one that shines, and for that, he gave everything. A church in crisis, scandals, division, and the loss of reverence. From abuse scandals to doctrinal confusion, the modern church is being purified in fire. But Francis insisted, this is not the end. It is a painful cleansing, one that Mary foretold long ago. There are wounds so deep, they do not bleed. They weep. And the church in these times has wept much. Not quietly, not behind closed doors, but publicly, globally, exposed to the harsh gaze of a world that once knelt at her altars and now watches from a distance, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in disbelief and disillusionment. The scandals that erupted in recent decades were not born in darkness alone. They were born in complacency, in hierarchy unchecked, in silence mistaken for prudence. The cries of the abused did not echo in marble halls until the world forced them to. And when the truth came, it came like fire. It came with names, with faces, with timelines and files and shame so heavy it threatened to collapse what had taken centuries to build. Francis did not deny the horror. He never dared to diminish the devastation. He faced it. And though many criticized his responses, too slow, too vague, too soft, those closest to him saw a man truly broken by the weight of it. He did not flinch from the purging. He embraced it, because he knew that a church built on appearance cannot withstand truth. That holiness, if it is to mean anything, must begin in humility. The house of God must be cleansed, not just of wolves, but of the spirit that allowed them to stay hidden. But the scandals were not only moral, they were doctrinal, liturgical, ecclesial. The faithful were no longer merely scandalized by sin, they were confused by silence. Homilies that spoke of kindness, but not of conversion. Bishops contradicting each other in public. Long-held teachings framed as suggestions. Truth diluted in the name of dialogue. And in the space where clarity once lived, chaos moved in. Francis knew this too. He watched the fragmentation. He saw how the sheep were growing weary, unsure of who to trust, unsure of what the church truly believed anymore. Altars once veiled in mystery became stages. Silence before the Blessed Sacrament was replaced with chatter. The sacred became casual. The Holy Mass, once the beating heart of the world, now rushed, overlooked, sometimes abused. And Francis, with a sadness he could not always hide, lamented the loss not of numbers, but of wonder. He knew Mary had warned of this, that when the Church forgets her holiness, her separateness, her sacred fire, she loses her salt, her light, her reason for being. That a church comfortable with scandal, and careless with doctrine, and casual with the sacred, is no longer a bride. She is only a memory. Yet even in the midst of this fire, Francis did not lose hope. He spoke of purification not as punishment, but as mercy. He said the bride must be stripped, not to shame her, but to restore her. That the fire is not the end, it is the beginning. That what is being burned away was never meant to remain. He called it a necessary suffering, the agony before the renewal. In his final reflections, he returned to the cross, again and again, because only from the cross does the Church understand herself. Only through suffering does she rediscover her strength. And only when her pride is broken can her purity shine again. Mary saw this, long before it began. She warned of the loss of reverence, of the betrayal from within, of a church that would wander. But she also promised hope, that her immaculate heart would triumph, that from the ashes something holy would rise. Not because we deserve it, but because God is faithful. Francis held on to that promise like a lifeline. Through every scandal, every headline, every bitter division, he looked beyond the fire to the promise. He believed in a church reborn, not through clever reforms, not through worldly power, but through penance, through prayer, through the return to awe. He believed that reverence would be restored, not by force, but by witness, by the faithful who refuse to compromise, who kneel when no one else kneels, who believe when no one else believes. But it is also the Church being remade. And in the end, Francis believed that she would be more radiant than ever before. Not because she escaped the fire, but because she walked through it and was not consumed. The triumph of the Immaculate Heart, but only if. Mary promised her heart would triumph. But there's a condition, our yes. Without prayer, penance, and a return to God, even the promise itself could be delayed. Francis believed this was the hour of decision. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of eternity. In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. It was not a wish. It was a promise. A mother's vow, sealed by heaven. But like every promise of God, it required a response. Not applause, not admiration, but action, conversion, obedience. Mary never spoke in riddles. She did not veil her warnings in poetic ambiguity. She came with clarity, She named what must be done: the rosary, the consecration, the return to penance, the offering of reparation for sin, and above all, the turning of hearts back to her Son. She spoke not as a mystic, but as a mother, not to impress, but to awaken. But for over a century, the world has drifted. The message of Fatima has been honored with statues, pilgrimages, prayers, and songs. But how many have obeyed it? How many have lived it, not as a devotion, but as a mandate? How many bishops have consecrated their dioceses? How many families have enthroned her heart in their homes? How many souls have returned to the sacrament of confession with tears, with urgency, with love? This was what Pope Francis saw so clearly in his final years, that the triumph of the Immaculate Heart is not automatic. It is conditional. Not because God's mercy is limited, but because the door of the heart must be opened from the inside. Grace cannot flood a soul that will not bend. Redemption cannot be forced. Love must be chosen. And we are choosing every day. In silence, in decisions, in habits and omissions, we are choosing either to hasten the triumph or to delay it. Francis once said, "We stand not at the edge of history's collapse, but at the edge of mercy's invitation." But that invitation will not last forever. The yes that Mary asked for is not dramatic. It is not shouted. It is not performed. It is whispered in confessionals. It is wept in silent chapels. It is spoken in the clutching of a rosary at night, when no one sees but God. It is the yes of the mother who forgives, the priest who keeps preaching, the teenager who kneels when others mock, the father who leads his home in prayer, the religious sister who offers her life in quiet reparation, the soul who suffers alone, yet unites that suffering to Christ. Francis believed that this yes, multiplied across nations, across families, across hearts, could still usher in the triumph. That the darkness we see now is not the end. It is the labor before the birth, the fire before the dawn, but only if we respond, only if we stop waiting for someone else to act. Even in sickness, even in controversy, even when he was misunderstood or maligned, he carried the message. He carried her plea. He called the church to return, not just to mission, but to Mary, to her heart, her purity, her fidelity, her yes. He said once that the Immaculate Heart is not a poetic image. It is a battle plan. It is the ark in the storm, the refuge in the shaking, and only those who enter it will endure the purification that is now upon us. He did not speak as one with power, but as one with urgency, not from a throne, but from a place of prayer. And in his final days, that urgency grew sharper. He did not predict dates. He did not announce apocalypses. He simply repeated her words: return, pray, penance, consecrate, trust, through war and famine and silence. It stands like a candle in the wind, flickering but unextinguished, waiting for us to guard it, to protect it, to carry it forward. And if we do, if we say yes, not once, but every day, then her heart will triumph not only at the end of time, but here, now, in the places where hope has died. Francis believed that with all his heart. And now the torch is ours. The promise remains, but only if we say yes. His final breath, a shepherd's last warning to the world. As he neared the end of his earthly life, Pope Francis left behind not only a legacy, but a final plea. Do not ignore the signs. Return to the gospel. Cling to the rosary. Prepare your soul. For what comes next will test the faith of the world. They say a man's truest words come at the end, when titles fade, when noise is silenced, when all that remains is truth. And in those final quiet days, Pope Francis spoke little. But what he did say echoed like thunder in the hearts of those who heard it. He was not afraid to die. He was afraid we hadn't yet awakened. That the church, the bride he had loved and served and bled for, was still sleepwalking through the storm. He had watched the signs unfold. He had traced them not only through news reports, but through the tears of pilgrims, the confessions of priests, the silence of empty churches. To the world, he remained the Pope. To the few at his bedside, he became once again Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the boy from Buenos Aires, the priest who walked the villas, the man who prayed alone before dawn while the city slept. And in those last hours, his voice barely more than a breath, he spoke what might be remembered as the most important homily of his life. He did not speak of politics. He did not speak of synods or councils or controversies. He spoke of Mary, of the Rosary, of the call to repentance that had echoed from heaven since Fatima and before. He whispered of the gospel, not as theory, but as rescue. He said the words so many had forgotten. Hell is real. Heaven is real. Sin is real. And the time is short. He said the warning had already been given. The map already drawn. The door of mercy still open, but only for a little while longer. It was not fear in his voice. It was ache. The ache of a shepherd watching the flock stray while the wolves draw near. He had spent his life trying to speak gently, trying to keep the church together, trying to build bridges and listen and love. But in the end, there was no time left for soft parables. He warned that what is coming would divide, not by politics or preference, but by faith. That a sifting was already underway. That comfort would not be enough to carry us. That only those rooted in prayer, in the Word, in sacrificial love, would stand. And then, he said something that those present would never forget. He said, "Tell them the secret is not in a vault. It's in their hearts. It has always been there. Return. Return before the shaking becomes the breaking." He asked for one final rosary, not for healing, not for comfort, but for the church, that she would be holy again, brave again, that she would remember what it means to kneel, to fast, to adore. He died not with fanfare, but with fingers still clutching the beads of his mother, the crucifix resting on his chest, the same crucifix he kissed as a young priest, decades earlier, in the silence of a back alley chapel where no one saw. He had come full circle, and now his voice is gone, but his final breath still speaks. Do not ignore the signs. Return to the gospel. Cling to the rosary. Prepare your soul, because what comes next will not be easy. But neither was the cross, and through the cross, through fire and trembling, comes triumph. His heart broke for the church, but he never stopped believing in her future, and now that future is in our hands. The time is now. Do not wait another day. This is not just a story. It is a summons. Not just the final chapter of a man's life, but the beginning of a call that now rests on your soul. You did not stumble upon these words by accident. Heaven doesn't work in coincidence. You were meant to hear this, to be reminded, to be stirred, to remember what you may have forgotten, that the hour is late, the war is real, and your soul, yes, yours, is part of the battle. Pope Francis did not reveal a secret to terrify. He revealed it to awaken. Because the most terrifying thing is not the wrath of God, but the indifference of man. A generation that no longer feels the weight of eternity. A church content with distraction. A people so busy with their own voices that they can no longer hear the whisper of heaven. Mary came with a warning. Francis echoed it. And now the echo is yours to receive or to ignore. But God has not forgotten you. He sees you, right now, in this moment. Not your appearance, not your achievements, but your soul. He sees the weariness you carry, the wounds you hide, the questions you dare not ask out loud. And He is not angry. He is waiting. Waiting for your yes, waiting for your return, waiting for your prayer that breaks the silence. Because this is not about the Vatican. It's not about prophecy charts or theories or fear. It's about you, about whether the fire will burn in your heart again, whether you will remember what it means to believe, to repent, to love a God who still weeps for the lost. You are not powerless. The saints were ordinary people who responded, who said yes, who prayed when no one else did, who carried the torch through the darkest nights. That same fire is being offered to you. Not tomorrow, not when life is easier. Now, pray the rosary, return to confession, pick up the scriptures, consecrate yourself and your family to the Immaculate Heart. Fast, intercede, watch. Do not wait for the church to rise without you. You are the church. And if you are still wondering whether any of this is real, then consider this. Why are you still here, still reading, still listening? Something in you knows the truth. Something eternal is whispering through the noise. Francis is gone, but his voice remains. You who are weary, wake up. You who are afraid, take courage. You who feel forgotten, know this. You are seen, you are called, and you are needed. So light the candle again. Say the first Hail Mary. Make the sign of the cross not just with your hand, but with your life. And if the world trembles tomorrow, let your soul be found on its knees, praying, repenting, believing. The gates of hell may rage, but they will not prevail, because the Immaculate Heart will triumph, but only if we say yes. Now is the time. Say yes. He gave his life in service to your church, spoke truth with tenderness, and carried the weight of silence for the sake of your people. Crown his suffering with peace, his faithfulness with joy. Let him now rest in the arms of the mother he loved and in the light of the Savior he followed. Amen. Thank you for watching. If this message stirred something in your heart, don't let it fade. Pray, reflect, and act. And if you'd like to keep receiving stories and messages like this, full of faith, truth, and hope, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's more to come. Together, let's keep the flame burning.